Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Ukraine War News Update, second part thereof for the 17th of September 2024. This is a military aid and assistance video. I didn't do one yesterday for the first time in an awful long time. I was trying to finish, and this is a message to Mark and Olena out there, who Mark said, when are you going to get your third installment of your trip to Ukraine video series that you've been working on? I went to Ukraine in February. Yeah, I don't have enough time. Anyway, I spent most of the day doing that yesterday, so hopefully that will be out imminently. It's completed. I'm going to test run it, see if it makes any sense. In other words, test run it. I'm going to watch it, see if it makes sense. So that's why you didn't have one of these videos yesterday, but now you have one. And we're going to start with the UK. And we have here Grant Shapps, the former Defence Secretary who lost his Member of Parliament election in the general election just recently, and he's no longer in government, or he's no longer an MP. But he, together with four former defence secretaries, have called for Britain to urgently regain their leadership role in supporting Ukraine. So when the war came along, the British government were quite forthright in their defence of Ukraine and support for Ukraine. You had Boris Johnson, like I've talked about many times, being incredibly popular in Ukraine, supporting Zelensky very personally, and also with weapons. We're at the forefront of main battle tanks being given to Ukraine, Storm Shadow cruise missiles. We've kind of pushed the envelope in really positive ways in helping Ukraine. Now, you can argue that we needed to have done more. The problem is our armed forces are in a really underfunded state. Then we had an election, and Starmer took over and sought to be... So if you remember, you had Boris Johnson, then he was basically ousted, and you had Liz Truss who ruled for like 42 days or whatever it was, and she was ousted. And then you had Rishi Sunak, but Rishi Sunak is very much a domestic policies kind of person. He's a former treasurer, so he Chancellor of the Exchequer, so he wasn't so comfortable at going abroad and meeting with people. If you remember, he went to D-Day commemorations and then left early to do a pre-recorded interview, and it was an absolute humdinger of a mistake. Anyway, you then had Keir Starmer taking over and being strong on Ukraine and coming out the blocks really quickly. You had the NATO summit, you had the big summit in the UK with regard to European defence and whatnot. And you had John Healey, the Defence Secretary, being really strong, going straight out that weekend as soon as the election took place. He was out in, I think, Odessa and Kiev, straight away. And so there was this move towards the UK continuing to be a strong supporter of Ukraine. The problem is there's this kind of £20 billion black hole at the moment in the UK economy, and there's all this infighting as to, what's going on. Are we going to have to raise taxes? We promised we weren't going to raise taxes. We now got in. There's no money. What do we do? So there's loads of internal politics going on in the UK. But then you've had this Storm Shadow and ATACMS strike restriction argument going on, and significant. So the context of Grant Shapps and others asking for the UK to become this kind of leader on Ukraine, I think, and I'm trying not to be too partisan here, but I think Keir Starmer has tried to do that in the last week, right? So he went himself, decided to go, this was on the behest of the UK, went to Washington. Starmer went to meet Biden to convince Biden to lift restrictions. It was for no other reason. And so that is, again, the UK trying to lead on something like this. Then I didn't realise, because it wasn't really being reported in this way, but he went straight to Giorgia Meloni in Italy from Washington, as far as I understand it. And in the newspapers, they're talking about, he's discussing the Albania initiative with the immigration and blah, blah, blah. And I was thinking, he's just in Italy doing his kind of diplomacy stuff. No. He, as far as I understand it now, he's in Italy because they're talking. Italy's one of the nations who is not happy with missiles being used deep into Russia, right? And they have Scalp EGs. They use Scalp EGs, and some of the Scalp EGs have come from Italy. So you've got France with Scalp EG, and Italy with Scalp EG, and the UK with Storm Shadow. And I think there's no coincidence that Starmer has gone straight to Italy after going to meet Biden to talk about lifting missile restrictions. So I think this, in a sense, the horse had already bolted. I think Starmer is trying to be strong on support for Ukraine. So Bloomberg is reporting that Starmer is to discuss Ukraine's Storm Shadow missile strikes on Russia with Meloni. The British and Italian leaders are also expected to say they discussed Russia's hybrid threat to Europe and reiterate their support for Ukraine's recovery. It's an interesting place to go, irrespective of the Storm Shadow Scalp sort of situation. I think it's Scalp they use. They may use Storm Shadow, I don't know. Anyway, Giorgia Meloni is in a very right-wing coalition government in Italy, and actually that's kind of the antithesis of Labour in the UK, although Labour have gone to the centre. So he has also been strong on forming strong relationships with European nations to kind of get over Brexit by not rejoining the EU, but by doing so. There's been this bilateral security agreement with Germany, and he's been to Germany to sort out stuff. I think he's being strong on security cooperation with Europe, which is exactly what we need when you've got a threat of Russia, both in terms of cyber and information attacks, but also in conventional warfare. UK needs to go out and say, right, we can't do this alone. We've been underfunding our military for an awful long time. Plus, it's also work in the cyber and information spaces. How can you and I, Germany, how can we sort this out together? Okay, EU, how can we sort this out together? No, we're not in the EU. Okay, Italy, we need to get missile restrictions released. We need you to change your opinion. I've been over to see Joe Biden. It's looking good. If Harris gets in, then maybe things are going to go, etc., etc., etc. The Kyiv Independent reports that UK Starmer is seeking European support for Ukraine long-range missile strike proposal. According to, again, Bloomberg, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni said she supports the decision of allies to give Ukraine the go-ahead. Now, that is significant. So if there's a bit of a change of position by Meloni and Italy, that is hugely significant. And if Starmer was anything to do with that, then pat on the back, I guess. But yeah, I could be trying to be too kind to Starmer. But I think, like, you look at not just the rhetoric, but also we've given a whole bunch of other aid to Ukraine just in the last few weeks. There's been other things. We've been expediting what we'd already promised. There has been movement. And you look at what he's done. We need to be at the forefront. And he's gone to the US to discuss with the most powerful person in the world, arguably, about getting stuff done for Ukraine, and gone straight to Italy and gone to Germany and done these things. I think, the proof of the pudding is in the tasting, and I think he's tasted quite a lot of pudding or something. Russia can use US components in Ukraine, but Ukraine can't use US components in Russia. The idea that now 70% of the components found in Russian weapons were made by US companies, while Ukraine is not allowed to use the US weapons on Russian territory. Now, it's not quite, it's a bit of a false equivalency, because actually the US, I'm sure, would be sanctioning those companies. They won't be allowing those components to go. That's happened either before the war started and components were made, or if they're new missiles, then they are stockpiles of components, or that they are getting onto the black market and going through ways that are very difficult to sort out. So it's not like they're saying, yay, we give permission to components to go to Russia and strike Ukraine, but boo, Ukraine can't strike Russia. It's not quite like that. But the general idea, this general sense of this being ridiculous, I get, right? It is ridiculous that they are not allowing Ukraine to fire American-made missiles deeper into Russia. And Bill Browder nails it in talking about how toothless the Russians have been with regard to their threats.
The reality is that, Putin thought he could win a war with Ukraine in 3 days, and it's now been 2.5 years. If he were to initiate a war against NATO, he would lose that war in 3 days. And he's not going to do that. And anybody who understands military strategy and military outcomes knows he's not going to do that. And so you effectively have two different types of people involved in the decision. You have the military men who are all saying this is nonsense. We should give the Ukrainians what they need. And then you have the non-military men, but the policy men who are analysts, not soldiers, who are all just sort of hiding under their desks and not wanting to be the person to take any type of risk that would push Ukraine's interests forward. The reality.
So the idea is that on the military side of things, actually, most people are in agreement that we should give weapons to Ukraine and allow them to use them as they see fit. And it's only politicians worried about escalation, but having an unjustified worry there that are stopping this from happening. So he says Putin would lose a war with NATO in 3 days. We should ignore Putin's saber rattling, allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to hit strategic targets in Russia. All military strategists think this is right. It's just appeasement policy analysts holding this up. And I don't disagree. Okay, now moving on to military aid, more generally. Important scoop from the Financial Times, says Colby Badwar. The EU plans to raise up to, and this has been widely reported now, 40 billion euros in loans for Ukraine without US participation. And again, this might be a reflection of trying to move away from dependency on the US with regard to the changing winds of, in the political landscape. The US wanted a $50 billion package, but with assurances that the Russian funds backing the loans would remain frozen long term. Hungary is blocking efforts to extend the freeze beyond the current 6-month renewable periods, so the EU will proceed on its own. Unclear how the Biden administration will proceed if the EU goes ahead with this plan B. They could still attempt to do a smaller loan in concert with Japan and Canada, because actually Japan hold quite a lot of frozen Russian money as well. So anyway, really good news that they're forging ahead, the EU, without the US cooperation on that. As well, the EU's directed 1.4 billion euros in profits from frozen Russian assets to purchase weapons for Ukraine. So not just about freezing the assets themselves and giving those, but the profits that are generated. That I think it's easier to do, legally speaking. I don't know. I presume that's already gone. There was all this talk about they're going to get some by the end of July, September, so on and so forth. I presume they've had a tranche of that already. Okay, now this is coming from Zelensky. So Western aid is not enough to equip even 4 out of 14 underarmed brigades that are needed on the front. Okay. So he's having he's venting his spleen, saying, foreign partners, aid from foreign partners isn't enough to equip even 4 out of 14 Ukrainian army brigades. The country needs to be ready. He said in an interview with CNN a couple of days ago. He didn't specify what the 14 brigades would be used for or where they would be dispatched. So these are brigades that aren't being used. These aren't presently operating brigades that just happen to be under-equipped. These are 14 brigades one assumes he's got in reserve, and this goes back to what I was saying in my first video today about could you see a bunch of attacks across the northern border in other places other than the one they've already done in Kursk. Now, throughout this interview, Zelensky used other examples to underscore that the Western aid sent to Ukraine is not enough to prevent devastating Russian attacks on Ukrainian cities and to be in a strong position for diplomacy. He also emphasized that the aid shipments are slow to follow after partners pledge them. This is absolutely true. It takes a bloody age for them to get equipment, or it's long-term assistance, like going into 2026, 2027 in terms of deliveries of certain bits of kit. Quote, during this 8-month pause after the positive decision of the US Congress to provide $61 billion aid package last April, what we did, everybody has to understand, we used everything we could. We moved to use what we had in storage, and whatever the reserve brigades had, those brigades that we need now to fight. So he had these reserve brigades, and they stripped them of all the stuff that they had to go and give them to the people fighting on the front, and they took everything out of storage because that 8 months absolutely hammered the Ukrainians. Zelensky also defended the Ukrainian military's command decision to launch the Kursk incursion into Russia in August to divert Russian troops there rather than keep Ukrainian forces in the eastern cross direction, where Russian army was making relatively rapid territorial gains over the past weeks. Zelensky said that it didn't matter how many brigades were defending the east if half of them are not equipped, specifically if he said they were lacking armoured vehicles and artillery shells, as Russian forces fired 12 times more rounds than the Ukrainian troops. We've heard many different claims as to the ratio of artillery fire. We had heard it was 7-10 to 1, then it's back down to 3 to 1 was the last I heard. It was actually 3 to 1, and now he's claiming 12 to 1, but he could be trying to scare people into acting more quickly. or quicker. In an earlier interview with Bloomberg on the 4th of July, Zelensky said that 14 brigades in the Ukrainian armed forces remain unequipped with necessary weapons that the US Congress already voted to send to Ukraine but were slow to come. He mentioned that these brigades could be used for Ukraine's counteroffensive if they had been properly equipped. We have the desire for the counteroffensive, but the tools have not come, he told Bloomberg. In a BBC interview, Zelensky said that Russia launched 4,000 guided aerial bombs per month in the east of Ukraine and destroyed 80% of the country's energy infrastructure because the US are hesitant to allow Ukraine to strike the airfields deep in the Russian territory, where the jets launching the bombs are stationed. We waited too long, he said. Russia's beginning to move those jets from 100 to 150 kilometers to 300 kilometers to 500 kilometers. After that, I would tell you, now we need more permissions. As of now, Ukraine doesn't have the permission from the US to use Western-provided weapons to strike inside Russia. Okay, now Latvia is to supply Ukraine with British-made CVRT armoured vehicles. The Latvians will provide Ukraine with the CVRT armoured vehicles previously purchased from the UK, according to the Delphi outlet on the 15th of September, citing the Latvian Defence Ministry. Now, there's been a lot of information going around on this, not all of it correct. The Kiev Independent reports that an unknown number of vehicles and not a lot of detail were disclosed, or were not disclosed essentially, due to security concerns. News comes shortly after Latvian Prime Minister announced a new military aid package for Ukraine, including armoured personnel carriers. The CVRT Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tracked is a British-designed armoured vehicle family that entered service in the UK military in the 1970s, existed in various variants, and is capable of carrying out a wide range of tasks. So Latvia operates at least 123 of these vehicles, namely Scimitar reconnaissance vehicles, Sultan command and control, Spartan armoured personnel carriers, Samson armoured recovery vehicles, and Samaritan ambulance vehicles. In 2019, the Latvian government signed a contract for over 80 more vehicles, though the number was later reduced to over 70. And the Latvian Defence Minister recently said that the procurement of new vehicles to replace the CVRT is in its final stages, so they're phasing these out by the looks of it. Latvia, one of Ukraine's biggest supporters, has committed to providing military support to the level of 0.25% of its GDP every year, and will provide thousands of drones. Now, this led people to then say they're going to give 123 CVRT, but actually the claim was they were going to give a company. Okay, let's go to Jeff 2146. It says, time to unpack this false information. Not necessarily from the Kyiv Independent, but others have been saying, for example, Sarin here is a source I often use, Latvia sending 123 CVRT Scimitar with 30mm guns to Ukraine, as an example. So, time to unpack the false information. First of all, wrong flag, and he's right, that's a Lithuanian flag. Latvia does not even own 123 FV-107 Scimitar. The country received 50 as part of their 2014 order and an additional 14 with the 2019 order for a total of 90 units. The Wikipedia listing has this tweet likely copied is incorrect as it mistakes the complete 2014 CVRT order of 123 vehicles, which included other models, which the Kyiv Independent says, like the FV-103, 104, 105, 106 and 7 training vehicles, as only containing FV-107s. In other words, it's not just the Scimitar, it's all those other variants like the Samson and the etc. etc. The pledge Latvia made was for a company-sized donation of CVRT armoured personnel carriers. Companies contain between 9 and 12 APCs, not 123. A follow-up article posted today again that said that the specific number of machines to be transferred was not disclosed. So, in other words, just be careful, not 123, but more likely 9 to 12, and don't know exactly what. Okay. Now, a little bit of confusion over this as well. So Ukraine will receive 6 Panzer Howitzer 2000s self-propelled artillery systems from Germany within 2 months, the German defense minister has announced. In total, 12 will be transferred for 150 million euros. Okay, so the general claim is 12 Panzer Howitzer 2000s are going to be delivered by Germany in the next few months, and maybe 6 of those 12 will be transferred at some point, but 6 maybe by the end of the year or next couple of months. Now, reporting from Ukraine here says Ukraine will receive 12 Panzer Howitzer 2000 self-propelled guns from Qatar enabled by Germany. Okay, so is this another 12? Or are those 12 that were already going to be provided separate, and now we have 12 more through Qatar, which means 24? Report says Sarin, Qatar exchanges a dozen Panzerhaubitze 2000s with new RCH. So these are the remote-controlled howitzer 155, the ones that Britain are going to be co-producing with Germany based on the Boxer chassis. These are, in fact, Italy has just agreed to take these on as their new self-propelled howitzers, which is interesting. So they're not going to try and produce them themselves. They're staying within Europe and using what is deemed as some of the best NATO equipment. So the Panzerhaubitze 2000s are supposed to be really good, and these appear to be replacing the RCH 155, are replacing those Panzerhaubitze 2000. You need fewer crew members, which is a bonus, and eventually these, I mean, they're called remote controlled howitzers. I think that's what RCH stands for. They are designed to, at some point in the future, be remotely controlled. Anyway, after maintenance in Germany, those Panzerhaubitze 2000s will go to Ukraine, so from Qatar to Ukraine. Next, it says Qatar to transfer 24 Panzerhaubitze 2000 self-propelled howitzers to Ukraine, according to the Bild tabloid newspaper. Qatar has decided to join arms supplies to Kyiv as part of a deal with the German government. Doha will hand over half of its stock of German howitzers, and in return will receive new vehicles from Berlin. Before being sent to Ukraine, the howitzers will be repaired in Germany. They'll be modernised, their software will be updated, and changes will be made according to the request of the Ukrainians. The process will be controlled by the largest defence companies, KMW and Rheinmetall. Then German aid to Ukraine says, okay, now, according to the Bild, the 12 Panzerhaubitze 2000s recently pledged to Ukraine are available thanks to a deal between Germany and Qatar. Germany has apparently authorised the export of RCH 155 howitzers to Qatar, which in return will hand over 12 of its 24. So not 24, 12 of its 24 Panzerhaubitze 2000s to the German industry, from where they'll be refurbished and delivered to Ukraine. Thanks to the German MOD, we already know that they are paying about 150 million euros for the delivery of these 12, while the total export volume to Qatar in the first half of 2024 was about 100 million euros, of which just the majority was this RCH 155 for Panzerhaubitze 2000 deal. So now you can guess how much money the German industry gets via this deal. The deal between Germany and Qatar to support Ukraine is actually not the first of its kind. Germany has already made deals with countries in this region in the past to enable exports to Ukraine. A prominent example, the first two IRIS-T SLM fire units, which were delivered to Ukraine via a deal between Egypt and Germany. In Ukraine, these two fire units can be recognised by their eye-catching sand camouflage, as shown in the picture. So there you go. Okay. There was also another deal between Qatar and Germany. Germany bought back, presumably for a lot of money, 15 Gepard Spags that had been sold to Qatar to protect the FIFA World Cup. Interesting. In the video that was later posted on X by the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany during training of Ukrainian soldiers, you can easily recognise them by their obvious camouflage. They were later recoloured green and delivered to Ukraine. They are easily recognisable by their single colour and built-in air conditioning. So yeah, another deal which enabled vital military assistance to Ukraine.
I have a friend from Ukraine.
And there's another one. That scared me a little bit. According to the German MOD, they plan to deliver 6 of them within this year, the remaining 6 to follow in 2025. So that seems only like 12 and not 24. Germany will also allocate another 100 million euros in additional aid to Ukraine. This was announced by the Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, and they'll be transferred to Kyiv this winter. And it is, I think, for winter aid. Baerbock noted the Russian is again planning a winter war to make the life of people in Ukraine as horrible as possible. So that might be in order to either mitigate or fix up issues caused by strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure and so on and so forth throughout the autumn and winter months. Okay, Denmark will deliver more F-16s to Kyiv soon. So it's a continuation of the original pledge of 19 fighter jets, according to Defence Minister Troels Lund Poulsen. The next batch will arrive before the end of 2024. That is awesome. Nice one, Governor. The Canadian Rochelle Senator MRAP. So this is the mine-resistant ambush protection vehicle version of the Senator. So there are a number of different iterations of the Senator as they've been sort of exploring how to I guess, evolve what was originally a security truck. The Canadian Rochelle Senator MRAP armoured vehicle has been authorised for use in the Ukrainian armed forces. The Defence Ministry reports a vehicle based on the Ford F550 chassis is equipped with armour to protect against explosions and small arms, has a V-shaped bottom, reinforced undercarriage, winch and night lights. Previously intended for the police, it has now been adapted for military use. Now, they have upped their production to a staggering, what was it, something like 9 a day or something of these. Or of senators. So Rochelle are really churning out these vehicles. They are getting, I think, orders from around the world as they have become prominent in Ukraine in their usage. Right. Ukrainian officials, quote, say mobilization is on track, but that it would take another 3 months before the newly trained troops could make an impact on the battlefield. The head of the Defense Committee of Ukraine's parliament, Alexander Zavitnevich, told the Financial Times. Now, this is good news that there are troops going through the system. In fact, Europe announced today, the whole continent announced it all in one voice, that they've trained 60,000 troops throughout the course of the war. So good job done there. Interflex in the UK has trained an absolute bucket load, including special forces and Marines. Obviously, we're quite a maritime nation. So, yeah. In Ukraine, the period of training for new recruits will be extended. The project will start in October to November this year, says General Sursky. This is probably in response to training not being good enough, really, and long enough for Ukrainian conscripts and mobilized and whatnot. They want to, I guess, give people confidence that if you are going to be signed up, you aren't just going to be rushed to the front line. You are going to be given the correct equipment and the correct training. Motivated instructors with combat experience will be involved as much as possible, and the possibility of creating a school of instructors is being worked out. So obviously working hard on, I mean, it's 2.5 years into war. You would hope that would have been done already, but they're doing it now. It probably in response to criticisms. Now, I'm going to read you through a long thread that I think became the basis of a Times article. Maxim Tucker here says, I spent much of last week with the men and women of Ukraine's equivalent of the US Navy SEALs, elite divers from the 73rd Naval Special Operations Center on assignment with the Times. The 73rd conduct reconnaissance and sabotage operations deep behind Russian lines, using stealth to infiltrate coastal defences underwater and mount surprise raids on high-value targets. They have been wreaking havoc on Putin's troops as Ukraine tries to drive Russia from its territorial waters. Operating in the black of night under the waves, a compass, watch, depth gauge and mental arithmetic are their only guides. Tugging on a rope strung out between them is their only form of communication underwater. While the Ukrainian military's land grab in Kursk, which is obviously going fairly successfully, has focused attention hundreds of miles to the north, the more strategic battle is being fought in the Black Sea. And it is one that Ukraine is winning against all odds with British and US help. Now, there's been this big old, and the General Staff have released video on this now, this big old attack on, and reporting from Ukraine's video was on that this morning, strikes on the oil rig, where the Russians sent 2 planes out as a surprise attack. One of their planes was shot down with the man-pads that was fired from one of these boats. The Russians claim that they destroyed separately. They've claimed 8 of the boats and 10 of the boats. No evidence of that's been provided. The Ukrainians haven't said anything. I don't know whether it was a successful attack. I mean, the rig was seen to have explosions on those videos, and there were lots of boats flying around. And you could come away thinking the Ukrainians had a really great success in attacking that. I don't know what their objectives truly were. Probably to take out the Russian electronic warfare and possibly air defense that was sat on there. Or it could also allow for it to have gone badly for the Ukrainians as well. We just don't know. Anyway, he continues, Tucker here. When Ukrainian special forces drove the Russians from Snake Island on June the 30th, 2022, 4 months after the invasion, they secured a corridor for the country to export grain from the port of Odessa. That was hugely important. Last September, Ukraine established control over a number of oil rigs, which today serve as a launch pad for attacks on Russian targets in Crimea. now clearing the Russians from the Kimburn Spit and Tendra Spit. So that's, if you imagine the Dnipro River comes down past Kherson, and as it comes out into a larger sort of estuary, it gets joined by the Bug River, and it comes past Mykolaiv and down and joins, and then you have a couple of spits. And the first one is the Kimburn Peninsula, and then the spit that goes off at the end, and that's opposite somewhere called Ochakiv, which is a marine training actually town, and there's artillery fire goes both ways, I think, over there. And then below that and to the southeast you have another spit called the Tendra or Tendriska Spit that the Ukrainians have attacked. That was a bit of a disaster. I think they lost a lot of these troops attacking that second spit, but there have been a couple of recent little I don't know, attacks, and certainly a lot of attention has been paid to the Kimburn and Tendra spits. Vital for unblocking Ukraine's second largest port, Mykolaiv. So you get a lot of traffic, maritime traffic coming down the Bug River, then would normally come out that estuary, but of course goes straight past the Kimburn Spit, and so you can't really do that. Mykolaiv is somewhat redundant as long as the Russians control the Kimburn Spit and the Tendra Spit as well, Tendriska Spit. These two streaks of land just jut across the estuary of the southern Bug River, allowing the Russians to sever the port from the sea. On one mission this summer, 4 Ukrainian divers dropped over the sides of their boat, disappeared under the waves, and moved towards the enemy coastline. Trained by the UK and US Special Forces and equipped with the state-of-the-art rebreathers, they swam in pairs, leaving no bubbles above them to give away their positions. That is fascinating. Didn't know you could do that. The Russians never saw them coming. When the first pair reached the Russian-controlled coast, they soon realised that they were alone. A technical malfunction forced the second pair to turn back. Alex, their commander, was watching through a drone feed but could not communicate with them without alerting the enemy. In preparing for our missions, quote, "In preparing for our missions, we go through all the what-if scenarios," says Alex. "What if the boat breaks down? What if the weapons fail? What if the explosives fail? Or half are lost? We talk through whatever we can imagine will go wrong. If we can, we continue the mission." Despite being down to 2 men, facing a battalion of enemy troops stationed in the area, the team leader decided to pursue his target. He found a gap in the barbed wire coastal defences that would save them precious time and pushed on. There are at least 500 soldiers in different locations. If the alarm sounds, they take up their position, start defending and looking out for divers, Alex says. And the divers have been ordered to take out an armoured Russian ZSU-23 for Shilka self-propelled anti-aircraft system. It's like an older version of a version of the Geopol in some sense. Hiding their diving equipment and moving inland undetected, the pair reached the road used by the Russians and planted their explosives. They then waited. When the anti-aircraft vehicle rumbled down the road under the cover of darkness, the divers pressed the detonator. We saw the vehicle blow up as well as the ammunition that was inside. There was a crew in that vehicle and they were transporting a shift that was supposed to rotate troops to their positions. We probably killed 8 to 10 Russians, Alex says. So these are the sort of things that happen without us realising at all. The Russians were stunned so far from the front they could not imagine they'd be attacked. We were listening to their radio interceptions. They were blaming each other for not providing maps of their mines. The divers escaped unnoticed, swimming back to their boat. So the Russians thought that they'd driven over their own mines. Among the operators of the 73rd Naval Special Operations Centre is Captain Judy, one of the few women to have undergone a NATO Special Forces qualification or Q course. You can read more about the 73rd Special Operations Centre in my full dispatch in the Times. US Western trained Navy SEALs unleash a wave of destruction. So appealing there to the Americans. We wouldn't call them Navy SEALs ourselves. Probably SBS, Special Boat Service, which is like the SAS, but in water. And interesting, I live around the pub, my local pub that burnt down. As some of you remember, I was absolutely gutted. A wonderful pub, the Osborne View, that sits on the Solent, overlooks, just down the road from me, overlooks Osborne House and the Isle of Wight. Actually, there used to be pictures up in there of the SBS because there was training in the Second World War around here for the SBS. There's a very close to me a naval air base. My parents used to live right next to it. Used to hear the last post every night over the tannoy. HMS Daedalus, it's now just called Daedalus. It's not naval, it's air sea rescue and a commercial little private sort of airstrip or whatever. But yeah, so around here there's quite a history of forces. It's a very naval area that I live in on the south coast near Portsmouth, and yeah, it's just interesting. SBS is involved in my local area. Anyway, I digress. They are rebuilding the pub. £6.5 million it's going to cost. France is committed to delivering 19,000 tonnes of railway track to support the recovery of Ukraine and help streamline its rail services and those in Western Europe. Said Pierre Halbron, France's envoy to the reconstruction of Ukraine. Okay, and then we'll move on to a few Russian things, some very important ones. Putin keeps expanding his army. He increased the size of the Russian army to 2.389 million personnel, including 1.5 million military servicemen. The last increase was in December 2023. So almost a year on, when the army reached 2.209 million, with 1.32 million military personnel. And now there is another expansion. So Putin orders another 180,000 to be recruited to the Russian army. Where are they coming from? December conscription, increasing the number of Russia's army to 2.4 million, also requires more than 180,000, as they have to replace those consigned to death or disability in Ukraine. Now, this is very revealing. So if everything was going according to plan, you would not need to recruit another 180,000 people, especially when you've also been claiming you've been recruiting 30,000 people a month. The idea, or, I say you, I don't know that Putin's been disclosing that, but the idea is that the Russians have been able to recruit 30,000 a month. They're losing over 1,000 a day at the moment. So the understanding is, if you're going to be charitable to both countries in believing both their figures, the Russians are taking a net loss whilst also recruiting an absolute bucket load of people. So just without this other 180,000, they would be, what's that, 360,000 they would have recruited this year, and they still need another 180,000. In other words, it really has been a very expensive year in terms of personnel losses for the Russians, and this is a tacit admission of that. They are in a lot of trouble. They're losing an insane amount of people, and having to recruit an extra 180,000 to increase the size of your army, because also what they're not doing is admitting what they've lost. So they're saying they're increasing the army, when in reality they're not increasing the size of the army. They've actually lost those people, but they're just not admitting those numbers. So we're going to increase the size of the army to 2.4 million, rather than say we need to replace what we lost. We're going to keep the army the same size. We just need another 180,000 people. That's how I'd interpret that. You can try and sell this as an army expansion, but in 2.5 years, the Russians have lost 54% of the territory that they took initially in the war. They're taking some ground in Pokrovsk and Vuhledar. Well, whoop-de-doo. The grand scheme of things, this is what I talked about in my frontline update last night. Whoop-de-doo. Okay, 10 years you've been faffing around in Ukraine, and this is where you've got to. You have decimated your own armed forces. Your naval fleet is now out of Sevastopol, down in Novorossiysk, and part of it, you're trying to build this place and put them in Abkhazia, but the president of Abkhazia himself, I think, must be a puppet leader, because it's kind of what you've stolen off Georgia, has, I think, announced yesterday, that he doesn't want the Russian Navy there. And your Air Force is not doing what it should be doing. Yeah, I think Russia they should be deeply, deeply embarrassed. They have utterly failed to do remotely what they wanted in this war. Now, the question is, that doesn't mean that Ukraine has won or will win, but they can prevail, and we can argue what prevailing means and what winning means, and there'll be different versions of that. But they can prevail if we get strong and support Ukraine as much as bloody possible. And we're just not doing that enough. Okay. Defense Express reports that Russians are attaching nails to their drone blades to disable Ukrainian drones. So this is drone-on-drone attacks. They put nails on their rotor blades, and I presume they're sticking the nails on top of the blade, the rotor blade, and the nail will stick out. So if they can weight that well enough so it can still fly, then as the rotor, it's a bit like a wheel on Mad Max or something like that, just with rotating blades, but as it rotates, it will. If you can just touch it rather than ram it into another drone, then you can slice it up with your nail, I presume. We put nails on our helicopter and landed on the enemy. The blades would break and it would fail. The publication quoted a Russian military officer as saying. Analysts believe that nails are used if the drone accidentally collides with the Ukrainian drone during a mission. I presume that it's saying two things there, but like, are they attaching it to their blades or are they attaching it to the drone so that it destroys the other blades? I don't know. Anyway, there you go. Bit of innovation there for the Russians. Thank you for watching. Hopefully that was of interest. It's a slightly longer video because I gave you that sense of what the Navy SEALs type people are doing for the Ukrainians, and I thought that was a useful account. Take care, guys. Speak soon.